Have you ever wondered why we avoid certain feelings, even when they keep us stuck in anxiety, depression, or physical pain? In today's episode, we are exploring ISTDP, Intensive Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy, with Dr. Suzanne Brown. This groundbreaking therapy dives deep and fast to break through the barriers holding us back from truly feeling our emotions. If you're curious about how ISTDP helps people face their fears, heal old wounds, and transform their lives, stay tuned because you won't want to miss this. Hi, welcome along. I'm Dr. Marianne Trent. I'm a qualified clinical psychologist. Thank you so much for being here. What an incredible episode we have lined up for you today. Dynamic therapy can get a bit of a bad reputation, and I definitely think that it's one of the ones that makes people think that you can read their minds when you meet them at parties. But today we're really having a close-up look at a modern dynamic therapy, and frankly, it's made me want to dive back headfirst into therapy to kind of explore what might be holding me back and how this might be affecting the relationships in my life. I would love to know how this resonates with you. What does this make you think about yourself? Please do drop me a comment, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Come and connect with me on socials too, where I'm Dr. Marianne Trent everywhere. I cannot wait for you to hear, to experience this episode. I will see you on the other side. I just want to welcome along our guest for today, Suzanne, Dr. Suzanne, should I say. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Marianne. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We've been trying to catch up for some time, and to be fully honest with our audience, we first met when you were a trainee and I was qualified in adult mental health service. So that's where we first crossed paths. But our lives have moved in very different directions since then, and you've been doing some really exciting work. Could you tell us a little bit about you and your background, Suzanne?
Yeah, so yes, we did. We met almost about a decade ago, I think it was. So following on from training, I went on to do additional training in America. So I would fly out 4 times a year to Boston to train in a model called Intensive Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy. And I was introduced to that on the training course, actually, but I just kind of followed it and pursued it as an interest post-course and during it. And then very quickly after graduating, and actually, I think still whilst I was in training, I'd begun to liaise with a local football team, so Birmingham City Football Club. And then from there, it just kind of expanded. So I always tell people I kind of accidentally fell into sport. It was never an intention. I have family that work in sport, which is probably the link. And yeah, so following on from that, I very quickly went into private practice from graduating immediately. Actually, I did part-time NHS for a year and part-time practice. And then I took a position with Arsenal Football Club, working with the women's team, the first team, and have worked around sports, so various different sports since, rugby, hockey, some Olympian work, transitioning in and out after the Olympics, supporting players whilst they are at the Olympics. Primarily, it's been football, and so most recently I was setting up the psychology department for Sunderland Men's First Team Football Club. And alongside that, I guess I have maintained a private practice. It's reopening now, but have explored various different avenues, and most recently, I would say returning much more to ancient methods of shamanic practice and sound healing, and very much embodied practice of therapy. So that's, in a nutshell, what's been happening over the last decade.
Oh, amazing. Well, you have been very, very busy, but also what I love, you've given yourself permission to do what excites and delights you and helps you get clinical results that really help people to thrive. And I think that's admirable.
Oh, thank you. I think the approach for me in terms of ISTDP, my first introduction to it was just an instant recognition, really, I would say, of this is what I think therapy should look like, right? Like this is, it just spoke to me at a very deep heart and soul level. So yeah, I knew I had to pursue it. And then I was fortunate enough to go to a conference where I met Patricia Coughlin, who became my trainer and later mentor. And again, it was a very similar experience of I must train with this woman. I just have to do it. So I have always, I think, supported that intuitive side and leaned into that, and more so recently.
Incredible. Could you give us a brief overview, if that's at all possible, about the approach and kind of what people could expect in a nutshell from it?
Okay, so it is a psychodynamic approach. So if we kind of just start with the assumption that we believe in the unconscious, right? So that actually the majority, if not all, of our behaviors are driven from this unconscious place that then tries to link these two very important triangles. And I think this is really important. If people could know about one thing, for me, it would be the two triangles. So the triangle of person. So when you're working in therapy with somebody, you're holding in mind the therapist, you're holding in mind the relationship then and how that links to their current life situation, who's in their current life orbit. And of course, where that stems from, so the past is kind of the other part of that triangle. And then what you're then mapping that across to is the triangle of conflict. So you're thinking about these underlying feelings that at some point we have learnt or been introduced to very, very early on, that in some way these are forbidden. We should not have these feelings. They should not be expressed. And they can include any feeling. So rage, grief, sexuality, joy, pride. People can feel anxious about any of those feelings. And so that's the other part. So feelings, anxiety, it gives rise to anxiety when these feelings start to rise and break through into the surface or the consciousness of the person. And then they employ we employ defenses to defend against that. So we all have defenses. They're part of our normal psychological development, but often they've become very rigid, very crippling to the person. So it's different and it deviates from normal psychodynamic therapies or maybe psychoanalytic tradition in that it welcomes resistance and it works specifically with resistance. We work with defenses and we see that they are interconnected with that anxiety. So there's a kind of a central dynamic sequence that we will follow. But of course, for me, it's the ultimate blend of kind of art and science coming together. Our sessions are videotaped, so we can review the sessions in between to see what we're missing. And obviously, we take that for supervision, so we can have our own blind spots explored. But of course, you're always responding to the person in front of you. So your intervention is always built upon the last response from the person in front of you. So it's very in the moment, very experiential.
Thank you. I actually did my 6th and final placement in a service offering that. And yeah, certainly the triangles is bringing me back to that, like the hidden desires, hidden feelings and all the conflict. Yeah, and I guess as an aspiring psychologist, being able to formulate from a variety of perspectives is so important. And I remember having to try and get my head around these triangles. I think for my first ever placement, my first ever adult placement, and being like having the book on formulation from Johnston and Dallas and trying to get my head around Milan and his triangles and trying to make sense of it. But it's kind of, it develops. And I think being able to formulate like that really helped me think very deeply about the client. I'm feeling quite grateful that I didn't have to record my sessions, I think, as a trainee. Oh, I mean, I did actually on placement 1 audio record some of my sessions. It's all for learning, isn't it? It's all for our growth and for our clients' protection and advancement in their therapy, but it can make people feel quite uncomfortable.
I think it does ask of you to confront your own inner, of course, conflicts. And I'm mindful of using too much terminology, but I guess that super ego part of ourself, right? Our inner pathology, our own inner parts that, again, if we were to kind of use an IFS term, our own inner parts that are more critical, are more harsh. And of course, it is a process. I think I actually did start recording during my training. And I think that is exactly what you were saying, to the point of what has enabled me to confront that is this deep desire to actually be able to give the person in front of me the best treatment possible. So I have to be able to see my failings and see my own contributions and, the things that I haven't been aware of and might be being enacted. And there's, since obviously learning this model, it's just such an incredible way to then receive supervision and to be able to give supervision to others that are willing, because you really have the material in front of you. There is no kind of distortion of this is how I think it went, or this is what I'm taking from it. So but it is a process and an inner journey, I think, and my own inner critic and having to meet that. And over the years, actually, I think work with that and mellow it itself.
Yeah. And does that make supervision a lengthier process than you might typically have?
No, so it would be traditionally still, we would work to a 50-minute supervision, but actually sometimes you might show the first 3 minutes of your supervision tape and you would spend the whole 50 minutes on that. Because actually, as we probably know, that first opening gambit is so fully loaded, right? Often the person brings, and I will start sessions without, I'm not intervening, I'm waiting for the person to see what they're bringing. It's so full of material and content. So we might just spend the first few minutes watching that. Other times you might jump through to a place of stuckness, or you might jump through to, this had an incredible effect and we got a breakthrough. And what did we do to get that? Because we want to maximize that. It's not just looking at, right, what do I need to improve upon? It's what do I need to maximize? What am I really good at that actually I need to lean into more because this has had a really great effect with this person?
Absolutely. It's that tweak and refine, isn't it? But it reminds me of trying to almost have the intro session with a client beforehand and encouraging them to start the session, because I think, especially with kind of the fiduciary relationships of power, people are used to deferring to the qualified psychologist or the position, the person in charge. And so for them to kind of be able to come in and think that they can start wherever they want to does mean you sometimes have to work with silence, which can feel triggering, especially as a trainee or a junior member of staff, I think.
Yeah. So the initial trial therapy is what we term it. And actually that is an extended session. So that will be 3 hours long, typically. So you're having a 3-hour long session with somebody. Now in that first part, you are really asking, what's the problems that bring you here? Because let's be honest, people come to therapy often because there is some suffering. And so what we're really getting clear on within that 3 hours, they're having an active exposure to the therapy first off, right? This is a joint assessment. Am I going to be a good fit for you as a therapist? And are you responsive to the model, right? How are you responding to the interventions? But for me, so much of that early trial therapy is being able to look at aspects that you're talking about there, with whether it be compliance or defiance or passivity versus being active. And even that initial question, what's the problem that you would like my help with? It really opens up the person in front of you's experience to dependency. Right? Am I going to depend on you? And what has happened in my past with the people that I did depend on? So you're right into their attachment system as soon as they sit down opposite you, really. So it's so the first trial therapy would always ask that, and they would then be, I suppose, help to understand that subsequent sessions, you are encouraged to be in the driver's seat. Because if I start the session, we're working from my agenda. And actually, I'm here to help the person in front of me. So I think there is a cognitive element to that, because some people have never experienced therapy. You do have to help them. But mostly, people have agency and they don't like to be overly controlled. Funnily enough, we don't like that. So I think once you're clear on that, and the task of therapy and the goals of therapy and the way that you're going to get there, then you're really off and you're into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it probably takes a bit of unschooling actually to kind of work in this therapy model, because even when I was an assistant, you know, you were encouraged to kind of plan and prep for the next session ahead of the next one. And you might kind of go in with a session plan about what you're going to do. But this is like the opposite of that. You know, you've spent your time perhaps formulating. I remember writing process notes, things like that. But this is really seeing, because you don't know what's happened in a client's life and what they've made of the previous session, and, you know, whether something's just, you know, blown up in their life, or whether they've had that moment of breakthrough or clarity. So it's really allowing the client to be right where they're at then, not where they were last week.
Absolutely. And it's such a good point, because for me, and I know I've had supervision where I've then gone back into the next session thinking, right, this is how I'm going to intervene. These are the defenses that are in operation. And I've got a different person in front of me. So all of a sudden I'm relating to a past version. And actually that's caused a rupture. And so following supervision again, I've been able to go back in and say, hey, I'm really sorry. I was relating to past week you, and I was missing you. I wasn't attuning to you. And that was just incredibly profound for this gentleman that I was working with. You know, I don't think he'd ever had anyone say sorry to him, right? And take real ownership and accountability of, I was missing you. But I also do think a lot of this is about the therapist being willing to look at their own barriers to emotional closeness. And some of that, I'm not saying all of that, because I appreciate the diversity of different models, but some of that can come from over preparation, control, bringing in a sheet in front, because it's creating such a barrier to engaging and being open and available to the person that is just in front of you. And can we connect human to human, heart to heart, soul to soul, right?
It's weird that I've chosen to wear a black roll neck top today, because I never wear black. And I know traditionally kind of dynamic therapists would wear very plain colours. They might have their hair tied back. You know, the room would be quite bland and, you know, not too distracting. But what you just said sounded quite human, and a desire to actually connect as a person. So that sounds very different than what kind of people might be imagining about the kind of Freud approach to this.
Yeah, so I mean, it derives from Freud's second theory of anxiety, but the Habib Davanloo was the person who really took Freud's, I guess he had an issue with this idea of analysis that was interminable, that would just continue on forever, and said, actually, we don't just have to give way to the resistance. We actually need to be able to use the resistance to kind of get to a breakthrough. And he was influenced a lot by even like Eric Lindeman's work of grief. So he had worked alongside him after the Coconut Grove fire disaster. And what he could see was that this external event gave rise to this intrapsychic crisis. And that is also at the heart of the theory really behind ISTDP. How can we facilitate the intrapsychic crisis so that the person can really be holding, and again, that I love, you know, many different models. I'm in my own Jungian analysis, so I can kind of think about it as, how can we hold the tension of the opposites of these things, right? Like a part of me wanting something, another part of me not. But actually it's designed to intensify that intrapsychic crisis within levels that are tolerable, right? We are tracking unconscious pathways of anxiety so that the person can actually get to the core of the issue. So it's absolutely not just about symptom management. It is really trying to resolve this at the heart of it, right? Free the person from the suffering so that they don't go on to, in Freud's terms, you know, the repetition compulsion, that we will find a way, you know, to continue to put the pain and suffering in our lives because we're not aware of it. But it's, you know, the conferences that we go to, because obviously the material is filmed, and I have such gratitude, you know, for the patients that are willing to share that material, because it means we can all learn, is, you know, honestly some of the most heart-filled, emotional material I've ever seen across training. And I like to kind of keep aware and abreast of other kind of modalities. But for me, it is completely about kind of heart-to-heart connection with the person in front of you. So very different from that blank slate, cold, perhaps idea that you might be having if you hear about traditional psychoanalytic methods.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting to reflect upon. And as you were talking about, apologizing to the client for kind of missing them, I felt that kind of a visceral shift. Like I felt something in my tummy. It's that connecting to another person and being seen as important, isn't it? And that you matter and you can have an impact on the world and you can have an impact on me. And for people that have been stuck and conflicted and perhaps not had the nicest, compassionate, responsive care, it's really, really important to let people know when you've got it wrong and that you're not perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the ability to be moved by another person. I'm thinking of times where I will show emotion, I will tear up, I will have, and it's not in a way that the person then feels they have to take care of me or, but in fact, that has had such a profound impact on people. And I remember in training actually with a woman where I had been moved to tears by her experiences. And I remember she came back and she said exactly that, like, I had an impact on you. And that had just kind of completely blown her away, that that her experiences, that her really her suffering, her pain could be felt and held and not be overwhelming to somebody, but could just be acknowledged and seen. So I'm very much, I encourage people to kind of be in touch with those emotions. It's very different, if I was having a reaction that was perhaps something about it has triggered something in me, then yes, I would want to be taking that to my own therapy or supervision. But I think it's very different just to be able to be open enough to be touched, at an emotional level, because, we work with the kind of the most intimate and deep emotions and feelings and experience of a person. So how could we not be, in a way? Like I'm kind of baffled. How could we not be?
Yeah. And I think if our audience are kind of hearing this and thinking, oh, is that transference? Is that countertransference? But actually you're being quite clear. This is not your own stuff being triggered. So for example, if I was working with grief, it might be making me think about having lost my dad, but it's not that. It's just being humanly moved by what you've been told, and you're moved for that person rather than moved for yourself. It's like, compassionate, like you'd stop someone in the street and go, are you okay? You don't look okay. It's that human connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also why, your own therapy, in my opinion, and supervision are essential, so that you have really worked through and are continuing to work through all of our own, relational patterns, our own disappointments, our own pains, our grief, our, all of that, because we are human too. There's no difference. There is no difference between me and the patient in front of me. We've got our own experiences, and I need a place just as much as they do, of course. But again, so that I can offer the greatest care to them, so there isn't some kind of countertransference reaction going on. And again, when there is, I can come back and say, this was my part to own in that, or, and I'm reflecting on that. And sometimes you can catch it beautifully in a session, right? You might be in the middle of what we would think about as projective identification, and you're able to actually, again, if your anxiety is regulated enough, you're able to have access to kind of seeing what is going on, and then be able to bring that into the session. So, I notice I'm really being pulled into feeling like an angry school teacher, and like I'm telling you off, and what's going on here? Because that's not usually my response. And they can then say, yeah, that's so true. And I find myself in that all the time. And then we're into something maybe about authority and a complex around that, or a conflict. But to me, it is just, have we done enough work on ourselves as psychologists, to be able to sit in front of another person and, to hear their experiences and be truly moved by them?
Yeah, and I think still, I'm right in saying that clinical psychology has no requirement for you to actually have done therapy of your own. So during my training, there was professional development groups, which ours was very well aligned and very harmonious and worked really, really well in terms of development rather than just conflict. That worked really well. But the other half of the cohort had a very different experience. It didn't feel safe. It wasn't a properly, what do they say, stormed, normed group. Like it was not safe, so it couldn't be used like that. But counselling psychologists, I think, do have to have their own therapy. And I think it's so important. During my training, I actually had Jungian analysis as well. And still, some of those kind of reflections, realizations, they've stayed with me. The only thing I didn't like, if I'm honest, is having to pay for sessions when I was on annual leave, even if it was planned months in advance. And the idea that my therapist would sit and talk or think about me in that session, that felt a little bit not very human, because this wasn't the cheapest of processes for me as a trainee. And I think it does have a tendency to be kind of quite consistent in terms of day of the week, time of the week slot. I found that hard as a user of the service.
Were you able to bring it up in the therapy? Were you able to talk about it with them?
To work through some of my rage.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is it. It's just such a good opportunity. Like everything is an opportunity, right? And yeah, I don't know. I guess there's something in that initial contracting, right? Like, what are we contracting to? And I just remember saying, in that even like talking about dependency, like I'm just so rageful that I need to be here in the first place. And, it really did. It really kind of brought up my own dependency, and I'm like pretty self-sufficient, thanks. And now I've got to rely on somebody. And yet it has become absolutely one of the richest relationships with another, but also actually to facilitate the richest relationship with myself. So, but I can appreciate that. And obviously, I think that is partly why the costs are very different. It is much lower in psychoanalysis than it tends to be in clinical psychology. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's almost something of like, to me, it's something about the commitment too, right? Like I have committed to this process. And now if I can't make it because my work schedule is, well, actually, I'm kind of, and I'm abandoning the commitment to myself, but I have got somebody else who I'm committed to. So I encourage the working through of the rage too, right? We get there eventually, one route or another. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm self-employed now, so I do get it as well. But yeah, it's like, thank you. Thank you for asking me that question, because that's really interesting in itself, and kind of seeing that process play out. Like, it's important stuff, and it can really help people to change their lives and change their relationships so that they're not just going around on that hamster wheel, really.
Yeah. And I love, it's always like, I guess, ironic, isn't it, that we know, let's say, for instance, the research says CBT therapists go to psychodynamic therapists for their own treatment. And I trained in intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, and I'm in the long-term, I'm 7 years in, I think it's really funny, isn't it, of how we are drawn to, maybe there is something quite whole about that, and kind of a wholesome aspect of that. And I think it can truly change people's lives. And it does come down to the common factors actually that make therapy effective, right? That's why I'm, a big supporter of many different modalities, because actually there's many ways to be effective. It's actually more to do, obviously, with things like therapist fit, and rather than the modality, and how authentic it feels to the person, and which is what is truly life-changing, I think. But also people do get a lot of experiences of bad therapy, right? Like, we'd be remiss to not mention that too. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you were to be working with an unnamed professional athlete, for example, how can you use this to help them improve their performance in whichever sport they are engaged in?
Well, I think it's exactly the same. If I'm sat down with an athlete, it would be no different to being sat down with a patient in private practice. So I am trying to understand what is the problem and how is it I can be of help. And then what will inevitably arise is resistance to me or resistance to themselves about accessing deeper feeling. And of course, that does translate, it ripples out into your life. So I'm thinking of an actual literal example of, they're having conflict with the coach, and how can they resolve that? Because they might be a high performer, but they're losing out access to maybe some important information from the coach, or they're keeping them at a distance, or they're being avoidant with them, that is inevitably, and has, I'm thinking of real life examples here, but is of course related to past figures, past experiences with those in authority where they have been mistreated or disappointed, or so it's really no different in that sense of us being able to sit down and face the feelings towards those people so that they don't keep getting anxious in response to these feelings and then doing all sorts of defensive behaviors like acting reckless and getting a red card and being sent off, or going out and drinking and eating badly, which, is not on their plan and is going to sabotage their, desires to be a better performer, but also affect their performance and impact the team. But that's just one example, say, because my experiences, and I think a lot of sports psychologists would at times, or have echoed this with me, that there are mental skills that can be very helpful, but in my experience, people just don't use them, right? They've been taught them, and unless you're getting through and you're able to break through that resistance that is, sometimes at the heart of the self-sabotage, they aren't going to use the things that are available to them. So we've got to first deal with that. Otherwise, you can teach them tools and you can talk at them, but it's not going to be of much help. So I try to weave in these principles, both in the one-to-one work, but I will run emotional fitness classes, which also tries to normalize, if you're human, this is going to relate to you. Other humans, you might find this useful. So we might talk about boundary setting. And obviously, you do need good access to healthy anger for that, right? You need to be able to say no and set a boundary and assert yourself if that boundary is violated or transgressed. At other times, you're going to lose that championship game and you're going to be devastated. And if you're blocking your grief to that, you might find that actually, instead of moving through grief, you got depressed. Right, isn't it going to be important for us to help you access the grief instead of going to a depressed position? So it's just so relevant because fundamentally we're emotional creatures, right? So you can't dissect this from any aspect of our life.
Oh, Suzanne, I feel like I want to have therapy with you now. It's making me think of a game I watched recently, or a snippet of a game I watched recently, where there was a biting incident, or what looked like a biting incident, and it absolutely made me, in a football game case, and I'm not familiar with what I'm talking about, somebody, I think, is what making me think, became frustrated and angry and acted out with their teeth. And it made me think about what I used to say to my children: we keep our teeth away from people even when we're cross, It's that very basic rule. But also the word bite for children, it's quite fun, isn't it? Bite, bite, bite. But, it's about thinking about when you're told no, how do you respond? My little boy, my youngest, used to take himself to the porch and headbutt the wooden floor because he knew that was a behaviour mummy couldn't ignore. He probably knew mummy was a psychologist and she was weird about brains. How are you gonna perform and carry yourself when you're told no, or when you're dealing with big feelings?
Yeah, and when the opponent is purposely trying to, get you going, is using material that is going to aggravate you, is, going to get you mobilized, or the referee isn't going to, fairness is a big thing. And obviously from a very young age, children are very in touch with fairness and justice. And if that has been violated at a young age, you can see where these conflicts arise, right? So the ref gives, an unfair card or a penalty or whatever it might be. And I think I think there's been a couple of biting incidents in, I'm also thinking of the quite famous boxing incident where, I guess we won't name people, but yes, it does happen. And we would, of course, be thinking of that as an acting out. So that is more defensive behavior, because the anxiety is so dysregulated that they might be feeling a primitive rage, right? That is very primitive, the desire to bite. And like you're talking about, this is the other beautiful thing that I'll often talk about, when people say, I'm not an angry person, or, well, you weren't born like that, because if you look at children, they are absolutely in touch with the full force of their raw feelings. And I have 2 kids and I am bitten regularly, Marianne. With both of them, they did, my older one has moved out of that, but my younger one does, and he headbutts and he pinches and he claws. And actually it's so primitive that pathway is there with us right from birth. And then over time, we learn that in order to preserve the connection, to preserve the relationship to the people we need the most, I'm going to have to suppress this. Mum, dad, teacher, coach can't tolerate whatever the feeling is. So I learn eventually just to not even notice I'm having the feeling, but maybe, and this I think is quite chronic, people are aware they're anxious. Or at other times, they've just become so used to that anxiety, they think that's how I am. So if I think, I can tell you I've worked with professional footballers that will say to me, when the ball is at my feet, I have ringing in my ears, my vision is blurry. That is an extreme level of anxiety. They're still performing at a very high level, but you imagine the energy that is then freed up when they've learned to regulate their anxiety. They've looked at the feelings that are generating that. They've got an absolutely different level of clarity and ability to perform. They're already performing at an incredibly high level, but they're absolutely crippled with anxiety, So yeah, I think it's it's essential in all areas, but we often have conflated, rage and anger with the actual destructive acting out. And I think it takes a lot of just, normalizing for people how, it's a very human, normal reaction. And part of what is quite well known, I think, in ISTDP is this idea of portraits. And maybe that would be referred to as active imagination in Jungian psychology, which is the invitation to face and feel the feelings, right? So actually to be able to portray what exactly you would like to do, that is, a world away from doing it. So just like I might say to my son, yeah, you do really want to hit your brother, but we don't, right? Like it's okay to have the feeling, but it's not okay to act out and lash him, lash out on him. So, yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting. So interesting. Thank you, Suzanne. Is there a right or wrong stage for people to start learning about this in their career? Are there books that people can kind of start reading before they begin any kind of training? Is there, I know that, for example, they don't let you train in it until you're a final year trainee. Are there any similar rules for this?
No, so there's a lot of books out there. So my kind of, I suppose the people that come to my mind are, of course, Patricia Coughlin. She has a number of books. Alan Abbas is very well known in the field. He has a number of books. John Fredrickson is, again, very well known in the field. Josette Tenhab de la Biche and Robert Naborski have collaborated on books. The thing I would say is this is a lifelong model, right? So I think what can happen, and this is, I suppose, something we're mindful of and we speak about in the community quite a lot, is that you can get so excitable when you come across this material and you see the videos and they look incredible, right? It's just fireworks on kind of the screen. And because they have been practicing for decades, it does look seamless. But of course, they will talk to you about, I could have gone off on this junction, I could have gone here instead. There's not a perfect way of doing it. But I think then the tendency is to rush in and try to apply these practices. And then it can go very badly, right? Because this is a very potent model. And so I think there needs to be an adequate respect for learning that and taking the time. And so the way that you train in the model, you do go into a core training, which is 3 years. And then after I've done advanced training after that. And then I stay in contact with peer groups and I seek out supervision. But it's really getting your head around, this is a lifelong learning. This is not going to be, you've done the 3 years and you're good to go. And that I think the principles are great, but the way that you learn it is that you actually take your videotaped material and you show it at every block. So you're constantly getting feedback in real time of the material that you're showing. And it did really feel like a group psychotherapy process as well. Patricia is particularly skilled at being able to kind of bring that group dynamic process in. So it's kind of like you're having your own therapy alongside it. But of course, there's a lot of material out there. She's also on YouTube. So is John Fredrickson. Michelle May is releasing a book that I think is going to be very accessible. So if people want to kind of have a read of it and how it's applied, I guess, from her own life and as a therapist and being in therapy, and go to a conference. That's where you're really going to get to see that material. So I think I was introduced to it on the doctorate. I saw a video and I signed up to a conference in Sweden. I was like, right, I've got to see more of this. This is the soonest conference I can go to, but go to a conference, see what you make of it. But I guess I would just encourage like a healthy caution that, we can get really carried away with this, but I wouldn't, want anyone to have too much hubris in thinking it's an easy model. It is very complex.
Yeah, it sounds it, but you have made it sound, I don't know, I was just a master in your field. I've loved chatting with you. How can people learn more about you and connect with you on socials if they want to, which I'm sure they will?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I am not super active on socials. It is something I need to get better at. But you can find me at the website www.emotionallyconnected.co.uk. I am on X and I am on Instagram, and we are definitely going into next year. I am partnering with some professional dancers to kind of bring very much this embodied psychology to life. So one of the hopes is that we will have, for professionals only, workshops that kind of bring together, we're calling it at the moment story, body, soul work. And it's really going to integrate story work with embodied movement practice, sound healing, and encouraging people to, of course, grapple with themselves. Because, of course, who you are determines everything that you're able to bring into the world. So if people want to register interest, they can reach out and email me.
That sounds amazing. I will absolutely be on the waiting list for that. Thank you so much for your time. I've loved chatting with you. What an absolute privilege to have spent this time with you. And I feel like our audience are incredibly lucky to have had you as a guest because, you've just been wonderful. So thank you.
Well, thank you for what you are doing and bringing many voices to this space. So it's very much needed. So I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. And on brand, I will say thank you, Suzanne. That makes me feel very seen. Very important. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh gosh, what an amazing experience that was speaking with Dr. Suzanne. Please do go and follow her on socials and check out her website too. What do you think to this episode? Has this wet your whistle to learn more? Has it made you think about the importance of accessing your own therapy? Or perhaps you're accessing this episode because you are considering ISTDP as a therapy approach for yourself. Has it sealed the deal for you? Please do let me know. Drop me a comment. If you're on Spotify, you can drop a comment as well. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please do rate and review. Wherever you get your podcasts, please do follow the show. It really is the kindest thing you can do for totally free for any podcaster that you appreciate. If you would like to come along to the Aspiring Psychologist community, which is my free Facebook group and is the exclusive home of Marianne's motivation and mindset sessions, please do so. You'd be so welcome. Thank you so much for being part of my world. If you'd like a little bit more and you're ready for the next step, please do consider the Aspiring Psychologist membership, which you can join for just £30 a month with no minimum term. And you can always access all of the replay content since the launch of the membership too. Please do check out the Aspiring Psychologist book and the Clinical Psychologist book. There may well be another book on the way at some point soon too. You heard it here first. I love providing this content for you. Please do let me know what you think. And if you wanted to buy me a cup of tea to say thank you, there's a link in the description for how you can do that. Or there's a link on any of my socials for my link tree too. I will look forward to catching up with you for the next episode, which will be available from 10 a.m. on Saturdays on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts from 6 a.m. on Mondays. Thank you. Take care.